The US has used economic sanctions as a tool to pressure countries aiming to force political and policy changes in many countries. In Venezuela, sanctions targeted the oil industry and government officials, seeking to oust President Nicolas Maduro by crippling the nation's economy. The impact has been severe, with ordinary citizens suffering from shortages of food, medicine, and other essentials as the economy deteriorated. Similarly, after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, the US launched a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, reimposing sanctions that targeted oil exports and financial transactions. These measures aim to force Iran to renegotiate the nuclear deal under US terms and curb its regional influence. The sanctions have contributed to widespread economic hardship, limiting access to critical goods and exacerbating domestic instability. These are just two examples from countless others of how the US has used its power to pressure countries into bending to its will. But we're not here to talk about the US. Instead, we're focusing on a new player in the industry, China. That has risen rapidly to become a global force capable of exerting influence over other nations.
China wasn't always the economic giant it is today. Just a few decades ago, it was a relatively small economy struggling with poverty and underdevelopment. In 1978, China's GDP was only around $150 billion. However, following economic reforms and opening up to foreign investment, the country's economy began to grow at an unprecedented pace. By 2010, China had overtaken Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. And by 2023, its GDP had surpassed $18 trillion, representing roughly 18% of the global economy. This transformation has been accompanied by a significant increase in military spending, with China's defense budget growing from just $20 billion in 1989 to over $230 billion by 2023. Making it the second-largest military spender in the world. In terms of military strength, China's People's Liberation Army now boasts around 2 million active-duty personnel, making it the largest standing military force globally. Its navy has become one of the most powerful, with over 350 ships and submarines. China also possesses a growing nuclear arsenal, with an estimated 350 nuclear warheads, compared to just a few dozen in the early 1990s. These developments have positioned China as a formidable global player, capable of projecting power and asserting its interests across various regions. China's rise hasn't come without friction, and there have been numerous instances where it has used its newfound power to pressure other nations. China's pressure on Taiwan has significantly intensified over the past decade. Taiwan, with a population of about 23 million, functions as a de facto independent state. But China views it as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland. In recent years, Beijing has increased its military activities near Taiwan, conducting frequent military exercises and sending aircraft into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. In 2020 alone, China made over 380 incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. This number rose to more than 970 in 2021, indicating a deliberate escalation. Additionally, China has used economic and diplomatic pressure to isolate Taiwan internationally, with only 13 countries now officially recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign nation, down from 22 in 2018. China has repeatedly threatened military action if Taiwan formally declares independence, and the possibility of conflict remains a constant point of tension in the region. China has been accused of using so-called debt trap diplomacy to exert influence over Sri Lanka. The country borrowed heavily from China for infrastructure projects, including the Hambantota port. When Sri Lanka struggled to repay the debt, it was forced to lease the port to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years. Critics argue that this tactic allowed China to gain strategic control over a key maritime location in the Indian Ocean, while Sri Lanka lost economic sovereignty. China's aggressive stance in the South China Sea is another significant example of its coercive foreign policy. China claims nearly the entire South China Sea, despite competing claims from several Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The Chinese government has constructed artificial islands and military bases in the disputed waters, using its military to harass and intimidate fishing and exploration vessels from other nations. The goal appears to be to establish de facto control over the region, which is vital for global shipping routes and contains valuable natural resources. The China-India border dispute is a long-standing issue, centered on the line of actual control in the Himalayas. The most recent escalation occurred in June 2020, when Chinese and Indian troops clashed in the Galwan Valley, resulting in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an undisclosed number of Chinese casualties. The LAC is poorly defined, and there have been numerous skirmishes over the years. Since 2013, China has steadily increased its military infrastructure along the LAC, building roads, airstrips, and military outposts. The Chinese side has also deployed thousands of troops along the contested border, with estimates suggesting a buildup of around 50,000 soldiers in 2021. This ongoing military standoff has resulted in multiple rounds of negotiations, but little progress in terms of de-escalation. The situation in Hong Kong reached a critical point in 2019, when mass protests erupted over a proposed extradition bill, which many feared would allow the Chinese government to target political dissidents. The protests grew into a larger movement demanding greater democratic freedoms. In response, Beijing implemented a national security law in June 2020, which drastically expanded the government's power to suppress dissent. Since then, more than 10,000 people have been arrested in connection with the protests, and dozens of pro-democracy leaders have been charged or jailed under the new law. The law has had a chilling effect on freedoms in Hong Kong, with several independent media outlets shutting down and political opposition being systematically dismantled. The number of political prisoners has surged, and many activists have fled the city to avoid persecution. China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region has drawn widespread international condemnation. Since around 2017, reports emerged that China was detaining Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in re-education camps, where detainees were subjected to forced labor, indoctrination, and abuse. Estimates suggest that over 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in these camps. There have also been allegations of forced sterilization, torture, and restrictions on religious practices and cultural expression. China's official stance is that these measures are part of a campaign to combat extremism and improve economic development in Xinjiang. However, evidence from leaked documents and satellite imagery points to systematic human rights abuses, leading to accusations of genocide by several countries and human rights organizations. China's policies in Xinjiang have been accompanied by extensive surveillance, with millions of cameras and other tracking systems monitoring the region's residents.
These few examples demonstrate China's willingness to assert its interests aggressively, whether through economic investments, military activities, or political suppression. Its actions have provoked tensions with various nations and have drawn global attention to the human rights situation within its own borders. These examples illustrate how China, much like the US, has leveraged its economic and military power to influence other countries and assert its interests. The rapid transformation from a struggling economy to a global powerhouse has enabled China to push its agenda and bend other nations to its will, making it a new force to be reckoned with on the world stage.